They say that compassionate people dare not watch this movie, not because it is based on a true story, but because your emotions will be difficult to control during the 127 minutes of the original film. When it comes to this film, brave people revisit it every year, while others dare not watch it a second time. The story is set in the United States in 1841. Because he was born in a big city and received a higher education, Solomon, despite having black skin, was able to enjoy the status of a free man, just like white people. At the time, he had a smooth career, a harmonious marriage, and 2 children, but suddenly, one day, his peaceful and happy life was completely shattered by the arrival of 2 men. The men, well-dressed and courteous, approached him, saying they wanted to hire a violinist to travel with their circus troupe for performances in another city. Tempted by the generous payment, Solomon was moved and naively believed their words, agreeing to travel to Washington with them. This marked the beginning of his 12-year life as a slave. After being deliberately intoxicated, Solomon woke up to find himself locked in a small dark room, his hands and feet chained with iron shackles. He tried to break free from the restraints, but it was in vain. Soon after, 2 unfamiliar men entered the room, and Solomon immediately tried to explain who he was and where he came from, but the men acted as if they couldn't hear him. Not only did they ignore him, but they also forcibly changed his name. A slave trader desperate to flee Georgia would not allow him to say the words "I am a free man," or else brutal punishment like this would immediately follow. Even after the wooden board in his hand was shattered from beating, the man still showed no intention of stopping. At this moment, Solomon was still unaware of the severity of the situation, thinking he still had a chance to escape. Enduring the excruciating pain from his wounds, he kept banging on the window, calling for help. But in this desolate, uninhabited place, it was undoubtedly a futile effort. Having completely lost his freedom, he could no longer prove his identity and, just like the other slaves, he could only live as one of them. They had to perform unbearably heavy labor every day and received no compensation in return. Moreover, cruel punishments could descend upon them at any time, anywhere. Having their flesh whipped until it was a bloody mess was routine. Dying from exhaustion or execution was even more common. What was even more outrageous was that, in pursuit of profit, even black citizens who were originally free became targets of slave traders. Once abducted and sold into slavery in a distant land, it meant falling into the gaping mouth of a bottomless abyss. Now, Solomon was one of them. Soon, he was placed on a ship heading to the United States. There were many others on board who, like him, had been abducted and trafficked. During this time, a man beside Solomon warned him that if he wanted to stay alive, he must speak less. He must never let the white men know that he could read and write, and under no circumstances should he reveal his true identity. On board the ship, Solomon also personally witnessed the deaths and punishments of others. A man who, for saying the wrong words, was forced to wear sharp metal restraints on his mouth. A man who was stabbed to death for attempting to resist. And finally, Solomon was forced to wrap the body of a companion who had planned to escape with him just the night before in a sack and throw it into the churning, murky sea. Watching the corpse gain what was ironically called freedom by escaping the ship, Solomon felt an inexplicable sense of envy. He just wanted to live. But now it seemed that even survival could only be barely maintained. When they arrived at the port, the plantation owners had long been waiting. All the slaves were to be sold with clearly marked prices. In the eyes of these plantation owners, they were nothing more than merchandise. At the auction, a plantation owner named Mr. Ford took a liking to Solomon and another woman. The woman begged him to also purchase her 2 young children. After some hesitation, Mr. Ford decided he would buy the children as well. This showed that he had a kind heart. However, the slave trader suddenly raised the price on the spot.
For God's sake, you're not sentimental in the least.
My sentimentality extends the length of a coin.
And in the end, the woman was forced to be separated from her 2 children. Her desperate pleading was answered only with a vicious kick from the slave trader. One day, Mr. Ford encountered issues with his lumber transport. With previous work experience, Solomon suggested using a water route, which could not only solve the immediate problem but also greatly reduce future transportation costs. His articulate speech and extensive knowledge made Mr. Ford develop, for the first time, a certain appreciation for a slave. Ford agreed to let him put the idea into action, and the results were just as Solomon had predicted. It saved both time and effort. As a reward, Mr. Ford gave Solomon a violin, but this did not bring hope. Instead, it brought danger. His excellence stirred jealousy in the lumber mill overseer, who constantly provoked him during construction. Solomon, still unaccustomed to being a compliant slave,
You Strip your clothes. Strip. I will not.
Could not tolerate this. He struck back fiercely. A man being beaten by Solomon, this was something unforgivable in that region. The laborers on the ranch couldn't swallow their pride. They all insisted that Solomon had to be hanged from a tree, and they really did it. At the brink of death, the overseer intervened, but he didn't rescue the hanging Solomon, he merely drove those men away. Then he sent a servant, riding a slow little donkey, to deliver a letter to Mr. Ford. He stood there coldly, watching Solomon struggle and gasp for life while hanging. The film lingered here in a close-up for a full 5 minutes. Solomon struggled to keep his toes barely touching the ground, while in the distance, the children seemed completely numb to the scene, still running and jumping around cheerfully, as if the person hanging there was nothing at all, not a human, not even something worth paying attention to. One by one, the doors of the slave quarters opened, and people came out, yet no one paid any attention to the fact that someone was hanging from a tree just a short distance away. This was an extreme form of mockery and even more bitter satire on the value of life. During this time, a maid quietly sneaked over to offer Solomon some water. This act stood in stark contrast to the indifference of everyone else, further emphasizing that it was the environment that had shaped the numbness of the slaves, and yet their numbness, in turn, perpetuated that environment like a vicious cycle. Eventually, Mr. Ford arrived and cut the rope, saving Solomon. One might have thought things would get better after that, but it turned out to be the beginning of another nightmare. Not wanting to bring himself too much trouble, Mr. Ford sold Solomon to Edwin.
It's no longer safe for you here. I don't believe you will remain passive if Tibby's attacked. I have transferred my debt to Edwin Epps. He will take charge.
Edwin was notoriously cruel and ruthless, and firmly believed that abusing slaves was sanctioned by the Bible. Falling into his hands was almost the same as falling into hell. On Edwin's cotton plantation, if anyone failed to pick a designated weight of cotton each day, they would be mercilessly whipped. Out of fear, the slaves there had not even the slightest awareness of resistance or escape. They worked from sunrise to sunset. They slept in a tiny dark room of less than 5 square meters, crammed with 20 people. They ate food that barely sustained life. Even when they were utterly exhausted, they could still be dragged up by Edwin in the middle of the night to dance. Becoming a slave was undoubtedly unfortunate, but that wasn't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying thing was becoming accustomed to the submission and adaptation that came with being a slave. Female slaves, in addition to enduring heavy labor, also had to suffer sexual assault from Edwin, and the girl Patsy was one of them. She was young and full of energy, able to do twice as much work in the cotton fields as anyone else in a single day. Her vitality stood in stark contrast to the perpetually gloomy and joyless mistress of the house, which made her favored by Edwin. Naturally, this also made her a thorn in the mistress's side. Whenever the mistress had the chance, she would make things unbearably difficult for her, until finally, Patsy was disfigured. Unable to endure the humiliation any longer, one night she begged Solomon to end her life. Solomon refused, instead trying to persuade her, saying that only by staying alive would they have a chance to regain freedom. But was that really true? In just a few months, Solomon had already learned how to endure. He pretended to be illiterate and uneducated, because if the plantation owner found out how much he knew, it would only lead to stricter surveillance. He willingly allowed himself to be treated like a clown. When the master wanted him to laugh, he laughed. When the master wanted him to cry, he cried. But was there really not even the tiniest exit in such a tightly confined and imprisoned life? The answer was yes, there was. That day, Edwin's wife gave Solomon a new task to go out and buy supplies. As he stepped out of the plantation gate, he couldn't help but feel this might be the best chance to escape. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became, and the faster he ran. It felt like he was just about to reach the other side of freedom, as if all the torment and humiliation were being left behind in that very moment. But suddenly, he ran into a group of white men in the middle of the road. They were executing runaway slaves. To avoid arousing suspicion about his true intentions, Solomon quickly explained that he was out buying goods for the mistress. One man glanced at the tag hanging around Solomon's neck, then allowed him to pass. That abrupt and brutal scene of execution seemed to serve as a reminder that freedom was nothing but a cruel dream. He thought he could go far, but in reality, the shackles on his feet had never truly been removed. They were still tightly fastened. That narrow exit might not lead to freedom, but rather to destruction. Later, while running errands for the mistress, Solomon realized that if he could just find a way to write a letter and send it home, there might be a chance to escape. For the sake of that freedom, He carefully collected mulberries, the juice of which could be used as ink. Then, late at night, trembling with fear, he wrote down his situation, every word and sentence filled with the longing to return home. Not long after, a pest infestation broke out in the cotton plantation. Edwin believed the slaves had brought the disaster to his land, so he rented them out to a local judge. This became the third master Solomon had served since being abducted. Although the work was still hard, the judge allowed him to perform the violin at banquets and even permitted the black slaves to keep the tips given by guests. Here, Solomon lived a relatively more comfortable life for a while. In a flash, 5 years passed, and with the revival of the cotton industry, the rented slaves were forced to return to Edwin's plantation once again. It was then that a new white laborer arrived, someone who, unlike the others, did not look down on them with contempt, but treated them rather kindly. Slowly, Solomon began to trust him. In order to escape life as a slave, Solomon took out all the tips he had earned from playing the violin and begged the man to help him send a letter home. He longed for freedom so much that he began to forget the ugliness of human nature.
To assist you, I put my own self at risk. I will do so.
After taking all of Solomon's hard-earned money, the man went straight to Master Edwin and reported him. Although terrified, Solomon managed to escape danger at this critical moment by relying on his extraordinary eloquence. Edwin.
How could I write a letter without ink and paper? Who am I gonna write to? I got no friends living as I know of. That Ormsby. That Ormsby's a lying, drunken fellow. Did he want you to hire him as an overseer? Well, that's it.
Upon thinking it over, arrogantly concluded that a black man could never possess such knowledge and courage. After narrowly avoiding disaster, Solomon could only endure the heartbreak and burn that letter. His disappointment in losing freedom now far outweighed his fear of death. It was from this moment on that he decided he would never trust another person again. From his early days of naively declaring his identity to justify his freedom, to silently enduring humiliation to survive, to seeking a chance to escape and then giving up, he had now almost come to believe that he was just another runaway slave from Georgia, recaptured and sold again, because the mistress wouldn't even give her a piece of soap. Patsy could no longer bear the smell of her own body. On the Sabbath, she went to the neighboring plantation to ask for a small piece of soap to bathe, but such a trivial matter triggered yet another brutal whipping. The mistress falsely accused Patsy of stealing the soap, and Edwin believed her. He ordered the overseer to tie her to a tree and then had all her clothes stripped off. In a fleeting shot, Patsy's back was shown, covered in horrifying scars. To them, this was all too ordinary, but it didn't stop there. Edwin even forced Solomon to whip her. Solomon didn't dare to strike hard, but even so, the barbed whip still tore through the skin with just one swing. Seeing that Solomon was reluctant to deliver the next lash, Edwin grabbed the whip himself. What followed was Patsy's near-hopeless cries, echoing through every corner of the plantation. Throughout the entire process, Solomon could only stand by and silently watch, or perhaps more accurately silently endure. He was filled with guilt, blaming himself for not agreeing to her desperate request that night. A new day. These 4 words, to Patsy, did not represent new hope, but only the repetition of her tragic life. Justice, though long delayed, eventually arrived. A man named Bass from Canada was invited to help Edwin build a house. When he saw how Edwin mistreated the slaves, he was deeply displeased. As his assistant, Solomon happened to overhear their conversation and had a strong feeling that Bass was a good man, but he didn't trust him as easily as he had trusted the last white man. After some time of cautious observation, he became certain that Bass was someone worth taking another risk for. During one of their conversations, Solomon mentioned that he had also been to Canada, and then shared the entire story of how he was kidnapped and sold into slavery.
Do you believe, sir, in justice as you said?
I do.
Slavery is an evil that should befall none.
I believe so.
If you truly do, then I ask, I beg, that you write my friends in the North, acquainting them with my situation, and beseeching them to forward free papers. It would be an unspeakable happiness to see my wife and my family again.
Upon hearing this, Bass was momentarily at a loss. After all, according to the local laws, Solomon was now Edwin's private property. If anything went wrong during the mailing of the letter, there was no way Bass would come out of it unscathed. Though extremely uneasy, when he saw the mix of despair and hope in Solomon's eyes, Bass softened.
I will write your letter, sir. And if it brings you your freedom, it will be more than a pleasure. It will have been my duty.
In the days that followed, Solomon could only wait patiently. Perhaps fate would be kind, or maybe his hopes would be crushed. He continued to pick cotton at Edwin's plantation every day, from morning to night, until one day, the local sheriff arrived with a lawyer and unexpectedly approached him. Along with them appeared an old friend by now. It had been 12 years since Solomon had been sold into slavery. Edwin refused to let Solomon leave, even threatening to take them to court. But when he saw the certificate proving Solomon's status as a free man, both his tone and his demeanor weakened noticeably. To avoid further complications, the friend quickly took Solomon away. Just before Solomon boarded the carriage, Patsy rushed over. Looking back on all these years, the two of them had long become each other's only solace in this hell. Patsy clung to him like a drowning person grasping at a life-saving straw, unwilling to let go. But under the laws of this country at the time, Solomon was not allowed to take any person with him upon leaving, and so, she could only stand there, dazed, watching Solomon's figure grow smaller and smaller in the distance. At this point, the film nears its conclusion. Back at his familiar doorstep, Solomon stood in front of his home for a long time, barely able to believe it was real. When his daughter placed her newborn, also named Solomon, into his arms, he broke down in tears like a child. That scene symbolized his rebirth. As one of the few black people who regained freedom after being kidnapped and enslaved, Solomon brought those who sold him to justice. He also actively participated in various abolitionist movements, striving to protect the most basic freedoms and human rights of black people. But in the end, all his efforts met with failure. During this time of relentless struggle, Solomon disappeared once again, and to this day, his body has never been found. 12 Years a Slave is adapted from Solomon Northup's memoir of the same name. This is a true story. A free man, kidnapped and sold into slavery. The story is told from the perspective of a free person because each one of us could have been him. Just as the film aims to convey the numbness and apathy that enslaved people showed out of fear, to some extent, allowed the system to continue. And what's even more cruel than the system itself has never been the written law but human nature. I'm a film enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.